अस्सलाम वालेकुम व्यूअर्स, उम्मीद है खैरियत से होंगे। आज हम आपको बताने जा रहे हैं मिस्टर चिप्स के मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेंट क्वेश्चंस। तमाम वो क्वेश्चंस जो मिस्टर चिप्स वाली बुक से जो है वो आपके आएंगे पेपर में। सबसे पहले, व्हेन वाज मिस्टर चिप्स बॉर्न? मिस्टर चिप्स वाज बॉर्न इन 1848 एंड वाज टेकन टू द ग्रेट एग्जीबिशन इन 1851 एज अ toddling child. Where did Mr. Chips live after his retirement? After his retirement, Mr. Chips lived at Mrs. Wickett's just across the road from the Brookfield School so that he could visit school easily. How did Mr. Chips measure his time when he was living at Mr. Wickett's house? Mr. Chips used to measure his time by signals of the past, just like a sea captain. He used to live his life according to the bells of Brookfield. Who was Dr. Merivale? Dr. Merivale was Mr. Chips' doctor and friend. He visited him every fortnight or so. He admired him and said that he was fitter than the doctor himself and was going to die a natural death. Briefly explain his preliminary interview with Mr. Weatherby. It was a sunny day in July 1870 when he had his first interview with Mr. Weatherby. The air was full of sweet smell and flowers. Weatherby said to him, "You are a young man, Mr. Chopping, and Brookfield is an old foundation. Youth and age often combines well." What advice did Mr. Weatherby give to Mr. Chips? What kind of person Weatherby was? Weatherby was a fatherly and courteous. He behaved very politely with Chips. He advised him to take a firm attitude from the beginning. That's the secret to maintain the discipline in the class. Who was the first boy punished by Mr. Chips at Brookfield? Coley, a red-haired boy, was the first one punished by the Chips at Brookfield. He dropped the desk lid during the first class of Mr. Chips. Chips punished him by giving him 100 lines to write. What kind of people and professionals did Brookfield supply? It supplies a fair samples of the history-making men like judges, members of the parliament, colonial administrators, a few peers and bishops. It also turned out merchants, manufacturers, professional men, country squires and person. What were the qualifications of Mr. Chick? He was an ordinary teacher with inadequate qualification. He was simply a graduate from Cambridge. Moreover, his degree was mediocre. What was presented to Chips on his retirement in 1913 when he was of 65, he retired. On his retirement, he was presented with a check, a writing desk, and a clock. Describe Mr. Wickett's house. Mr. Wickett's house was situated across the road to the Brookfield. The house itself was ugly and pretentious, but that did not matter. It was convenient for Mr. Chips. The room Mrs. Wickett let to him was a small, but it was a comfortable and well lit. His room was decorated simply with schoolmasterly taste. How did Chips meet the newcomers? Mr. Chips made a special point of getting to know all the new boys and having them to tea during their first term. He always ordered a walnut cake, and during the winter term there were crumbs too. He sent them off at 5 o'clock. What did Exum tell Mr. Chips? He told Mr. Chips that he was the nephew of the Major Collingwood, who was an old student of Mr. Chips. Once Chips had thrashed Collingwood for climbing to the gymnasium roof to get a ball out of the gutter. He might have broken his neck. What did Mr. Chips tell Mrs. Wickets about the Major Collingwood? He told her that once he had punished Collingwood for climbing onto the gymnasium roof to get a ball out of the gutter, he might have broken his neck. Who was Mrs. Wicket and what were her services for Brookfield and Mr. Chips? Mrs. Wicket was the landlady of the Mr. Chips. He had worked as in charge of the linen room at the school before she left the job. She let a room to Chips after his retirement and served him till his death. What kind of books did Chips read? Chips usually read classical books. There were a few books on history and belles letters. There was also a pile of cheap detective novels in his room. Who was Major Collingwood? Collingwood was an old student of Mr. Chips. Mr. Chips remembered him very well because he had thrashed him once of the climbing onto the gymnasium roof to get the ball out of the gutter. He might have broken his neck later. He joined the army. He died in Egypt during the World War One. Describe the first meeting of Mr. Chips and Catherine. One day, climbing on the great gable, he saw a girl waving excitedly from a dangerous looking ledge. He hastened to her because he thought that she was in trouble and needed masculine help. But she slipped and wrenched his ankle. The woman was Catherine Bridge. It came out that she was not in danger, she was signaling to her friend. What were Chip's views about the modern woman? Mr. Chips didn't like modern women of the 90s. He was shocked by the women riding a bicycle and reading Bernard Shaw or Ibsen. He disliked Shaw and Ibsen for their reprehensible views. How did Catherine look? Or write a note on Catherine Bridges. Catherine was a young girl of 25. She had the blue flashing eyes, freckled cheeks, and smooth straw colored hair. She was a governess out of the job. She married Chips in 1896. She died during childbirth on April 1898. What were the political views of Mr. Chips? Mr. Chips was a conservative in politics. He disapproved of the modernity. He disliked Bernard Shaw, Ibsen, and William Morris for their reprehensible views. What kind of political views did Catherine have? In politics, Catherine Bridges was a radical with leaning towards the views of the Bernard Shaw and William Morris. She believed that the women ought to be admitted to the universities. She also thought they ought to have a vote. Was Catherine happy with Chips being a teacher? She liked being among boys. She was happy that the Chips was a teacher and not a lawyer and a dentist or a broker or a big businessman. She liked the teaching profession because a teacher influences those who are going to matter to the world. What influence did Catherine exercise on Mr. Chips, or Catherine made Mr. Chips a new man? Is it true? She made him a new man. His eyes gained sparkles. His humor became rich and mature. He began to feel confident. He disciplined improved. Who was old Gribble? He was the school butler. He was the last man at Brookfield who knew that Chips had married. Who was Ogilvy? Old Ogilvy was a choir master. Mr. Chips remembered him for a funny anecdote which involved the Ogilvy and Dunster. Dunster had put a rat in the organ loft when Ogilvy was taking choir practice. How did Catherine influence Chips in improving his discipline? Catherine often tendered her advice to Chips. He did not always take her advice, but it definitely influenced him. In the matter of discipline, she often advised him to be lenient when he was inclined to be harsh. In certain cases, she urged him to be strict when Chips wanted to be lenient. Why could Chips not write a book on of his memories? Mr. Chips could not write a book of his because writing tired him both physically and mentally. Beside his recollections lost their charms and flavors once they were writing down. What was the April foolery did Chips face? He was sitting at his desk. Someone said that there were letters for him. He opened them one by one. All letters contained a blank sheet of paper. He thought that it was a strange. Describe Catherine's tragic death. Catherine's tragic death made Chips deeply grieved and lonely. She had her newly born child died during childbirth on April 1, 1898. They died on the same day. What do you know of the Faulkner? Faulkner was a student at Brookfield who had met Mr. Chips on the day his wife died. He sought leave from Mr. Chips to receive his family at the station. What did Chips say to Lloyd George? Mr. Chips did not follow any formalities during his conversation with the Prime Minister. He said, I am nearly old enough to remember you as a young man. I confess that you seems to have improved a great deal. What news about Grayson's father came finally? Grayson's father had sailed on the Titanic, and there was a rumor that he too had drowned when the ship sank. There came news that his father had been among those rescued. What do you know of Mr. Ralston, or what kind of person was Mr. Ralston? Ralston joined the Brookfield Public School as a headmaster in 1900 at the age of 37. He was a strict disciplinarian, ruthless, ambitious, and energetic, and fine power transmitter. He raised the status of Brookfield. He left Brookfield in 1911 to better himself as he was offered the headship of a greater school. What allegation did Ralston level against Chips, or what was the Ralston indictment of the Chips? Ralston said that the Chips method of teaching was old and lazy. His personal habits were slovenly. Ralston blamed him that he ignored his instructions, which was sheer insubordination. Who was Sir John Rivers, and why was he in favor of Chips, or why did John Rivers favor Chips? Sir John Rivers was the chairman of the board of governors. He visited Brookfield. He ignored Ralston and went direct to the Chips. He supported Chips because he thought of the Ralston as too clever. He said that a fellow like Ralston wanted to watch. What do you know of the Meldrum? Mr. Meldrum was headmaster of the Brookfield Public School between 1870 and 1900. He succeeded Weatherby as the headmaster and held this post for 3 decades. He died of pneumonia in the year 1900. What do you know of the Grayson? Grayson was an intelligent student at Brookfield. His father sailed in the Titanic in its maiden voyage. Grayson was found attentive by Mr. Chips in the class. It was presumed that the Grayson's father had died as the Titanic sank in the Atlantic Ocean. Grayson's father was rescued from the Titanic, but Grayson's died during the war. Describe briefly Mr. Chips as a teacher. As a teacher, Mr. Chips was quite conventional. He did not believe in the importance of the examination and certificates as the marks of the education. He believed that the education should be set up to teach children a sense of proportions. What is the significance of the year 1913 in the life of Chips, or what happened to the Chips in 1913? In 1913, Chips had bronchitis and was off duty for nearly the whole of the winter term. This made him decide to resign. He was 65 then. He bought it unfair to keep going if he could not do his duty well. Described the farewell speech of the Mr. Chips. Chips made many jokes during his farewell speech. There were several Latin quotations in it. There was also a reference to the captain of the school team. He also revisited the past of the Brookfield School as a teacher. He mentioned the first bicycle, the lamp boy, the 7-week frost, and the day when the big hall was turned into hospital ward due to German measles. What were the activities of the Chips after his retirement? इसका आंसर है जी he invited the new boys as well as masters to tea, watched matches, dined with the head, and the masters took on the editing of the new edition of the Brookfieldian Directory, wrote articles and read newspaper and detective novels. What happens to the Brookfield during World War I? During the War of 1915, military camps were established near Brookfield. The soldiers used to playing field for sports and training. The younger masters either left the school or joined the army. Draw a character sketch of the Chatteris. Chatteris succeeded Ralston as the headmaster of the Brookfield. He was a science graduate. He got on well with Chip and recognized in Chips a Brookfield institution. He urged Chips to join Brookfield during the war as it needed him. Chatteris died in April 1917. What do you know of the Forester? Forester was the smallest new boy Brookfield had ever had. He was about 4 feet high, above his muddy football boots. He was killed in 1918 in Cambria. What different matters did Chips discuss with the Linford? Chips talked of the Shropshire, Linford hometowns of the school and school life in general. and of the news that the new day's papers, Chips also told him that he was growing up into a very difficult world. Who was Linford? Linford was a new boy at the Brookfield. He hailed from the Shropshire. He did not have any family relation at Brookfield. He had recently come out of the sanatorium. He was the last boy who visited Chips before his death. Describe the death scene of the Mr. Chips. Just before his death, Chips' mind was full of dreams and faces and voices. His own words and the names of his students sang in his ears. And when he died, he seemed so peaceful. तो ये थे जी क्वेश्चन मिस्टर चिप्स के। ये तमाम क्वेश्चन आप अच्छे तरीके से तैयार कर लेंगे तो आपका पेपर बहुत अच्छा हो जाएगा। कमेंट में हमें ज़रूर बताइएगा कि इनमें से कौन से और कितने क्वेश्चंस आए। अल्लाह ताला आपका हामी नासिर हो। हमारी दुआएं आपके साथ हैं। नेक्स्ट वीडियो तक अल्लाह हाफिज़।